In the winter of 1944, the German soldiers' world had shrunk to the size of a muddy foxhole and the weight of an empty stomach. For Unterofficer Hans Weber, stationed on the Siegfried Line, the war was no longer fought with bullets alone, but with a gnawing, persistent hunger that broke the spirit faster than any artillery barrage. The German supply lines, once the pride of Europe, had become a desperate ghost of their former selves. Hans sat in the freezing rain, clutching his daily ration, a single slice of Kommissbrot. It was a dark, heavy bread, but it wasn't the hearty loaf his mother used to bake. By this stage of the war, it was laced with sawdust and potato flour to stretch the grain. It was the bread of despair, bitter, dry, and barely enough to keep a man standing, let alone fighting. For breakfast, there was ersatz coffee, a vile, lukewarm liquid made from roasted acorns and chicory. There was no sugar, there was no cream, there was only the cold. Hans remembered the propaganda films Goebbels had shown them back in Berlin. They had portrayed Americans as soft, pampered shopkeepers who would crumble the moment they faced the hardened warriors of the Reich. The German soldier was supposed to be the Übermensch, a man of iron who didn't need the luxuries of the decadent West. But as Hans looked at his shivering comrades, their ribs sticking out and their eyes sunk into their skulls, the irony was bitter. To the east, the supply horses were being slaughtered for meat. To the west, the Allied air forces had bombed the rail lines into oblivion. The German military machine was starving to death. The psychological breaking point came not from a defeat on the battlefield, but from the trash left behind by a retreating American unit. One afternoon, while scouting a farmhouse that had just been vacated by U.S. paratroopers, Hans found something that shattered his worldview. In a discarded cardboard box, he found a half-eaten bar of Hershey's chocolate and an empty tin that once held Spam. He picked up a small, waterproof packet. It was a K-Ration accessory pack. Inside, he found something he hadn't seen in years. Real white sugar, a stick of chewing gum, and 4 pristine factory-made cigarettes. Hans stood frozen. If the Americans were so bankrupt and collapsing, how could they afford to give a common soldier chocolate and cigarettes? How could they have the logistical power to ship fresh white bread across an ocean while the German army was eating sawdust in its own backyard? As he chewed on a discarded American biscuit, Hans realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't just fighting men, he was fighting an industrial titan that considered candy and tobacco as basic necessities. The bread of despair in his pocket felt heavier than ever. In that moment, the propaganda died. Hans didn't see a soft enemy. He saw an unstoppable machine of abundance. And he knew, with a sinking heart, that you cannot defeat an army that eats like kings while you starve like dogs. The K-Ration Revelation was more than a discovery of food. It was the moment the German soldier realized he was fighting a war against the future. By late 1944, the average Lancer was accustomed to the field kitchen model, a centralized horse-drawn wagon that brought hot soup once a day if it wasn't destroyed by Allied jabos first. But when the Americans arrived, they brought a technological marvel that the German High Command couldn't even fathom, the individual K-Ration. Unteroffizier Friedrich Schmidt first encountered the revelation in a captured American foxhole near the Ardennes. Expecting to find the same misery he lived in, he instead found a small, waxed cardboard box no bigger than a paperback book. It was light, waterproof, and labeled simply Dinner Unit. As Friedrich pried it open with his combat knife, his eyes widened. Inside wasn't a mess of loose grain or a slab of hard black bread. It was a masterpiece of industrial logistics. There was a small tin of processed ham and eggs, a pack of fortified biscuits, a compressed fruit bar, and a packet of lemon-flavored drink powder. But it was the extras that truly shocked him. Tucked into the corners were 4 cigarettes, a book of matches, a piece of chewing gum, and even a small roll of toilet paper. To a German soldier who had been using old newspapers and leaves for months, the inclusion of toilet paper was a psychological gut punch. It signaled that the American military cared about the individual dignity of its soldiers. It suggested that their enemy was so wealthy, so organized, and so advanced that they had mechanized even the most basic human needs into a portable waterproof box. Friedrich's comrades gathered around as he tasted the fruit bar. It was sweet, rich with sugar that hadn't been seen in Germany since the early days of the war. They passed around the cigarettes, the smell of real Virginia tobacco filling the damp air of the trench. For years, Goebbels had told them that the Americans were a disorganized rabble of cowboy civilians who couldn't handle the hardships of a real war. But as Friedrich looked at the empty K-Ration box, he felt a wave of cold realization. This box was proof of a factory 3,000 miles away that could produce millions of these units, ship them across a submarine-infested ocean, and deliver them directly into the hands of a soldier in a muddy hole in France. The K-Ration Revelation broke the myth of German superiority. Friedrich realized that while they were fighting for every scrap of horse meat, the Americans were fighting with the full weight of the world's greatest industrial engine behind them. The war wasn't just being fought with tanks and planes, it was being won by a waxed cardboard box. In that moment, the German combat morale didn't just bend, it began to crack. Because you can survive a battle against men, but you cannot survive a battle against a civilization that treats chocolate and cigarettes as standard ammunition.
In the psychological warfare of the European theater, the most devastating weapons weren't always the 155mm howitzers or the roaring engines of the P-47 Thunderbolts. Sometimes, the weapon that finally broke the German soldier was a 2-ounce bar of Hershey's chocolate and a pack of Lucky Strikes. This was the chocolate and cigarette factor, a phenomenon that turned American luxuries into symbols of inevitable defeat for the Wehrmacht. For a veteran German soldier like Gefreiter Karl Baum, luxury was a forgotten concept. By late 1944, his tobacco was a foul-smelling mixture of dried leaves and sawdust, and his only sweets were occasional spoonfuls of beet jam. Sugar had become a strategic resource, prioritized for the high command and industrial needs. So when Karl's platoon captured an American supply truck stuck in the mud of the Lorraine region, they didn't just find supplies, ular janatni topashte. They found paradise. As the soldiers tore into the crates, they found hundreds of tropical chocolate bars. Karl unwrapped one, expecting the chalky, bitter taste of the German war-grade chocolate. Instead, he tasted real cocoa and sugar. It was a sensory explosion that reminded him of a world that no longer existed in Germany. But as he chewed, the sweetness turned to ash in his mind. He looked at the date on the wrapper. It was fresh. This chocolate had been manufactured in Pennsylvania only months ago, shipped across the Atlantic, and delivered to a muddy road in France just so a private from Brooklyn could have a snack. The cigarettes were even more demoralizing. German soldiers were used to rationed, harsh tobacco that burned the throat. The American GIs, however, seemed to have an endless supply of C-ration packs. Karl picked up a discarded pack of Camels near a captured foxhole. The paper was clean, the tobacco was light and aromatic, and every GI seemed to have a silver Zippo lighter that worked even in the wind.
The message was clear and terrifying. The Americans were so rich, so industrially dominant, that they considered pleasure to be a combat necessity. To the German soldier, who was told to sacrifice everything for the fatherland, seeing an enemy who fought with a chocolate bar in one hand and a high-quality cigarette in the other was a psychological blow. It destroyed the Nazi myth of the decadent American. If these soft Americans could outproduce, outship, and outfeed the master race while still providing candy to their frontline troops, then the war was already over. The chocolate and cigarette factor created a massive rift in morale. German diaries from the period are filled with entries expressing disbelief at the American bounty. They realized they weren't fighting a nation on the brink of collapse, as propaganda claimed. They were fighting a titan that could afford to be generous. To many German soldiers, the smell of American tobacco smoke drifting across no man's land wasn't just the smell of the enemy, it was the smell of a superior civilization. It was a realization that made the cold trenches feel even colder, and the German victory feel like a distant, impossible dream.
In the history of the Second World War, there's a famous anecdote that perfectly encapsulates the moment the German officer corps realized the war was truly lost. It wasn't when the Soviets crossed the Oder, nor when the Allies broke out of Normandy. It was the moment a captured German general saw a fresh American chocolate cake delivered to a frontline officer for his birthday, shipped all the way from the United States. But for the common soldier on the ground, the ultimate symbol of American logistical magic wasn't cake, it was the white bread. For years, the German soldier had lived on Kommissbrot, a dark, dense, rye-based bread that grew increasingly bitter and hard as the war dragged on. By 1944, it was more sawdust than grain. To the German mind, bread was a heavy, dark struggle. So when they first encountered American field rations, they were confronted with something that looked like it had fallen from another planet. Soft, fluffy, snow-white bread. Lieutenant Werner Holzer first saw it during the retreat from the Mons pocket. His unit had stumbled upon an abandoned U.S. Army field kitchen. There, sitting in wooden crates, were hundreds of loaves of white bread wrapped in wax paper. Werner picked one up. It was light as air. He pressed his thumb into it, and the bread sprang back into shape. It was fresh. This was the white bread legend. To the German soldier, this wasn't just food, it was a terrifying technological achievement. They knew that to produce white bread of this quality, you needed high-grade wheat, industrial-scale mills, and most importantly, a massive logistical chain that could bake and deliver fresh bread to the middle of a war zone. Werner sat in the dirt and tore off a piece. It was sweet, enriched with milk and sugar, luxuries that had vanished from Germany years ago. As he ate, he looked at his men. They were staring at the bread with a mixture of hunger and profound sadness. They realized that Goebbels' propaganda about the starving, bankrupt Americans was a total lie. The American supply system, the Red Ball Express, was so efficient that it could deliver fresh baked bread to a soldier in a foxhole, while the German army was struggling to find enough horses to move a single artillery piece. The psychological impact was devastating. It created a sense of logistical intimidation. The German soldier felt like he was fighting against a ghost in a machine, an enemy that didn't just have more tanks, but had a civilization so productive that it treated fresh white bread as a basic right for every private. In many accounts of German POWs, they mention that the sight of American white bread was the moment their combat morale finally snapped. They felt like primitives fighting against a futuristic titan. The legend of the white bread spread through the German ranks like wildfire. It whispered a simple, inescapable truth. You cannot defeat an army that can bake fresh bread 3,000 miles from home.
The dark, heavy rye of the Reich could not compete with the industrial, airy white of America. The war of the kitchens had been won, and with it, the will to keep fighting. By the spring of 1945, the German army was no longer a cohesive fighting force. It was a collection of starving men trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The surrendering for a square meal phenomenon became the final, decisive blow to the Wehrmacht's endurance. It was a time when the stomach began to dictate terms that the heart could no longer refuse. For Obergefreiter Dieter Lange, the war ended not with a bang, but with a piece of paper fluttering down from a clear blue sky. It was an Allied safe conduct pass dropped by a passing P-47 Thunderbolt. While Nazi officers threatened to shoot anyone caught holding these leaflets, the soldiers secretly stuffed them into their boots. The text on the back didn't just promise life, it promised a menu. It detailed the warm meals, the fresh coffee, and the unlimited cigarettes waiting for those who crossed the line. Dieter hadn't eaten a hot meal in 2 weeks. His unit was surviving on stolen raw potatoes and melted snow. He watched as his comrades stared toward the American lines, not with hatred, but with a desperate, hollow longing. Every time the wind shifted, it carried the scent of American field kitchens, the smell of frying bacon and hot stew. It was a psychological weapon more effective than any propaganda broadcast. One evening, Dieter and 3 of his closest friends made their move. They didn't wait for a grand battle. They waited for the silence of the night, crawled through the frozen mud of the Ruhr pocket, and walked toward the silhouette of an American M24 Chaffee tank. Dieter held the crumpled leaflet above his head like a holy relic. "Please," he whispered as the American sentries surrounded them. "The meal, is it true?" The reality exceeded the promise. Within an hour of being processed, Dieter was sitting on a wooden bench holding a heavy mess tin filled with hot meat, gravy, and mashed potatoes. He saw a mountain of sliced white bread and a vat of steaming real coffee. He watched as American GIs carelessly tossed away half-eaten donuts, a level of waste that was incomprehensible to a man who had seen his comrades kill each other over a crust of rye. This was the ultimate surrendering for a square meal. The German soldiers realized that the Americans weren't just winning, they had already won. The abundance was so total that the Americans were using food to recruit an entire army of prisoners. For every German who surrendered, 10 more heard the stories of the American kitchens and lost the will to pull the trigger. Dieter realized then that the Third Reich had been defeated by the assembly line and the supermarket. As he took his first bite of hot food in months, the ideology of the master race evaporated. He was just a hungry man, and the enemy was the only one offering him a future. The war was over, not because of a grand strategy, but because the American square meal had proven that life under democracy was far sweeter than death under a fading swastika.